playing out currently in the world that laying the foundation before we get into what's going on is kind of important. And that's why I gave note cards, and I have some note cards up here. If anybody has topics and ideas that they would like to see discussed in future cases, future workshops, I'm happy to take those at the end. And throughout, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So these are the firm dates that we have. The rooms reserved. July and August will be at Lexington Park, at the Lexington Park Library. September hasn't been reserved yet. You have a window when you can reserve, and that one just hasn't been reserved yet. So that's why that one is tentative. And then we'll reserve more rooms as there's interest expressed. All right, and I do want to say, we could spend hours, and books and novels have been written about the history and how we got here and the Constitution and breaking it down. This is going to be a very broad overview of everything. So there are going to be cause and effect things that have been left out just for the sake of time, because I don't think you want to be here for hours on end through the afternoon. So this is a brief overview of how we got where we're at. And why is it important to look at this and to study this? So the American experiment, as it was called, was the first time in history that a government was established by the people for the people. There have been other times in history that government has let the people have a voice, but this was the first time it was really established that you get the consent from the government. Now, how we got there is kind of funny. You have to follow the money, right? It's always about the money. We're skipping ahead to the founding, 1763, the Treaty of Paris, French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, it's known as both, that ended. And Britain said to the colonies, okay, we spent a lot of money sending troops over, paying for this war, providing everything that you guys need, and now you need to pay us back. We need to increase taxes. And to put into perspective, because Americans never liked paying taxes, the difference in Britain at the time, it was, and I wrote this down to make sure I give you the right number, 26 shillings per person per year is what they paid in taxes. And in the colonies, it was 1 shilling per person per year. And so England said, hey, just chip in a little bit more, because we pretty much doubled our national debt. It cost us, in today's dollars, almost $1 trillion to fight this French and Indian War on your behalf. So throw in some more money, and the Americans went, nah, we don't want to. And there was a lot of pushback on paying any more in taxes. And that's where we also get the term no taxation without representation. Parliament, you had people who were representing the British people, and they could approve the taxes. The colonies did not have any direct representation. And part of it is they didn't actually want it, because then they would have nothing to complain about. But it was also one of those that the time it took to send a representative, to get information over, to vote, to send the information back, just logistically, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to have colonial representation. And they said, well, you're British subjects, you're represented, you're fine, pay your share in taxes. And they tried to raise the taxes to a rate of paying about 70% of what the British subjects did, and the Americans still went, no, we don't like that. The Stamp Act was the big one, that everything, all of the papers that were used in the colonies, letters, envelopes, and it had to have a stamp, had to have a seal saying, you're going to pay tariffs. Does that sound familiar? And you're going to pay this extra tax on top. If you're going to get your stationery, if you're going to get your letters, if you're going to get your newspaper to print on, you're going to have to pay this extra. But England said, you're gonna pay your fair share, and if you don't pay your fair share, we're going to do things like send troops into your towns to enforce it. We're going to start using our military against the civilian population in order to get what we want out of you. And so you had other acts that came in, like the Townsend Acts, that made it more and more difficult for the American lives and brought in more and more of the British rule of the military enforcing the laws, the taxes, all this along the way. Now, Boston is always known as kind of the hotbed of things back in the day. Boston was one of the biggest cities where there were riots and protests. Protests in the street. And then the military was sent in to quell the protests. And so the redcoats were sent to Boston in droves, and they took up sentry outside of the customs house. The customs house was pretty much the tax house. That's the symbol of where the taxes were levied. You're going to protect the people who collect the taxes and raise the taxes. And so there were sentries outside of the customs house. And the rebel rousers, the people would walk by and they'd make snide comments, they'd throw snowballs at them. And there was one wig maker who walked by and told the sentry on duty, "You haven't paid for your wig," which I personally find it funny that the Boston Massacre started over comments about wigs. And so words were exchanged and voices were raised. And then the mob that was already on edge and already angry from being taxed, from having the military in their homes, having their guns taken away, being told to pay too much money, the mob starts getting angry. And they're getting angry at the customs house and the redcoats that are outside the customs house. And so they come and they start throwing snowballs, and they start throwing snowballs packed with rocks and sticks and paddles. And the sentries line up, and at first, all they're doing is standing there. But then they start loading their guns. And then one of them is hit and falls to the ground and is hurt. And when he gets up, he fires. And now, does anybody know how many people were killed in the Boston Massacre? When you think of a massacre, think of a lot of people. 5 people died in the Boston Massacre. 5 people. 11 people were wounded. Well, 5 died, 6 wounded, 11 people total injured. The first person to die was named Crispus Attucks, who was a freed slave. And he was actually used as the symbol of the abolition as time went on. Because he died in defense of our nation, our value, well, what would be our nation and values, the American republic that it would become. So that was the Boston Massacre. It was a whopping total of 5 people, but it ignited and sparked the flame that spread throughout the land, because during this entire time, there was not a consensus of we need to be our own country. Most people at the time were still saying, hey, we don't like what the king is doing, but we need to tell him what we don't like, and then he'll see it our way, and he'll make things better, and everything will be fine. And the vast majority of people saw themselves as loyal British citizens. They're just really mad right now. So the Boston Massacre started, and that's when it became, why is our king, why is our leader using our military against us and killing us when all we're saying is we have issues with you? Now, let's keep in mind they were throwing rocks and things, but this kind of sparked the flame and was the big initial idea that they will use the military against you in violence. And it was also part of the subset of colonists who wanted to be a separate nation, using that as propaganda to say, look and see what they're going to do. And so that's why when you hear Boston Massacre, it sounds like a whole lot of people were killed, and that was part of the propaganda of the day, but it was a true propaganda of they killed their own citizens because they were, throwing rocks. So after the Boston Massacre happened, then we have the Boston Tea Party. So in retaliation, the king said, hey, you're still going to pay taxes. We're going to ease up on the taxes a little bit, but we're just going to shift things to still try and raise taxes. If anyone has seen Pirates of the Caribbean, you may have the East India Company, and they're sailing their ship. The East India Company was failing because their prices were too high. They transported a lot of tea. But you could smuggle in tea or get Dutch tea at a much cheaper rate, and so that's what the colonists were drinking. But Britain came in and said, you can't trade with them anymore. You can only, it's a monopoly now, trade with the East India Company and buy their tea. And ships came and they were loaded up with tea. Something I found interesting, it's not the tea we think of as loosely, it's like bricks of tea. And they would have to shave it off and make it so that it was usable, but it's, just think of bricks of condensed tea is what they actually had in these crates. So these ships came over and ships went to New York and New York said, no, you can't dock here. And they went into Boston and the locals in Boston, because again, keep in mind, Boston is a bunch of hotheads. They're a bunch of, that's where all the rabble-rousers were. They said, okay, you can dock here. We're not unloading the tea. So we're not going to unload your tea. So it's just going to sit there and rot on your boat, which is something that happened in North Carolina. They let them dock, but the tea just went bad. And the mayor of Massachusetts said, you can't leave either. You can't find another port. We're just going to make your tea go bad. And there was a lot of infighting until a few dozen locals dressed up like Native Americans went onto the ship and chucked it all overboard. And so now, once again, you have a bunch of locals in Boston saying, we're not paying your extra taxes, we're not paying for your tea, we're not doing the things that you want to do because you're not listening to us, and we're not going to pay you extra money. From there, it starts becoming more and more difficult with things like the Intolerable Acts. This is where Britain came and said, we're going to start confiscating rooms in your home, and we're going to make you put troops in your home. We're going to start making you lock up all of your weapons so that you can't do anything to our troops. You have to lock up your weapons in the armory, so you can't have a handle on that. And you can hear echoes of a lot of things that are in our Constitution from a lot of these acts. And then the rest of it, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, that was the first engagement. Shot heard around the world. No one knows who fired the first shot. It is still in dispute, but that's what kicked off the revolution. And then we have the timeline that will go into a little more detail of some of these things up until the Treaty of Paris and the end of the American Revolution. All right, so, but it's always about the money, and it's always about taxes. That was the big one that we still have issues with today. Some of the contributing documents, these are early documents from throughout history that gave the ideas of our founding fathers when we're getting to establishing our own country. Where are we getting these ideas from? The Magna Carta is one of the earliest ones. That was in England. And it said everyone, including the king, was subject to the laws of the land. No one is above the law. We hear that a lot now. No one is above the law. And this comes from the Magna Carta. It also gave Englishmen their basic rights and freedoms. It said, yes, as a human being, you do have some basic rights. Not as many as we enshrine in our Constitution or in the Magna Carta, at least not at this point, but it did lay that foundation. A lot of the colonies had this idea of self-rule and self-determination, and that the government is ruled by the people. And they had things like the charters of the Virginia Company, which guaranteed the rights of Englishmen to the colonies. So yes, you're in the colonies, but that doesn't mean you lose all of your rights. And we have that same idea in our Constitution today. Just because you may be overseas, you still have the rights of an American, right? It's that idea that these are your human rights. And then the Virginia Declaration of Rights served as a model for the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. That's when the colonists came and they drafted state constitution. And a lot of these state constitutions, they pulled the ideas of a Bill of Rights guaranteeing individual rights for people, not just explaining what the government's going to be, but explaining what your rights as an individual are and what the government cannot infringe upon. So some of the ideas came from different people and philosophers at the time. Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, he was British born but moved to Pennsylvania. You're welcome to come in. He wrote one of the most famous pamphlets, which is Common Sense. And he was one of the contemporary philosophical thinkers that worked with the Founding Fathers, that was friends with Ben Franklin, that started suggesting the idea that England's kind of corrupt, maybe we should break away. Some of the other people, it was not so much, not all of these were contemporaries, but their ideas were what contributed. So John Locke, his ideas were grounded in the social contract theory, that the rulers only ruled by the consent of the governed, and you only rule if you are doing what is in the best interest of the people that you are ruling over. And that social contract theory is, there's not a divine right. There's not a God-given right to just behave and do whatever you want. It is, you are ruling with the consent. And we are saying, we are fine with you ruling because you're doing what's best for us. So John Locke had these ideas, and these ideas that you had natural rights, life, liberty, and property. No ruler should be able to take those away from you. They are inherent in you. Montesquieu, he promoted the separation of powers and checks and balances. He was a little bit more of a pessimist, that he did not think people were great and good, and he did not necessarily think that governments would always act in the best interest of the people. So that's why you needed to separate out the powers, you needed to check and balance the powers, because if you consolidated it too much into one person, then it would be much easier to corrupt it. And these are all ideas that we hear all the time in our Constitution. These came much earlier, but developed into what we wrote into our Constitution. Rousseau and the social contract theory, he was another one, that governments derive the power from the consent of the governed. This was a big one in the Enlightenment age during this time period, that the shift in thinking from these people are born into power and they deserve power, or they were born into nobility, so therefore they're above us, they're better than us. And this is a huge shift in thinking that no, we have the equal rights and the equal input into our government and what decisions should be made for us. One that doesn't get talked about often is the Iroquois Confederacy. The Founding Fathers, and there is written documentation that people like John Adams met with the Native American leaders. And there's Benjamin Franklin, who, in a very not politically correct way, said pretty much, if the savages of the Native Americans can figure out a way to work together for the greater good, why can't we? And a lot of this was derived from the Iroquois Confederacy, where the different tribes came together and they promoted things like the mutual defense. So all the states coming together, the colonies coming together, and we're going to fight in defense of our nation, a mutual defense. Or conducting foreign affairs. We will talk to foreign nations and come back for what is best for all of us together. And the Iroquois Confederacy was one of the early ones that Ben Franklin said they had a need for a voluntary union like the Iroquois Confederacy. That one's not highlighted a lot in our history books growing up, but it was a big contributor of, if they can do it, we can do it. So then we get to the Declaration of Independence. And I know there's a whole lot of American history that I'm glossing over and skipping over. By the time all of the bad things that the king did and that Britain did to the colonies and people got fed up, it was still a minority of people who wanted independence. However, they sent their contingent of people to Philadelphia, and they said, go and figure out what to say to the king. And they wrote a list of grievances. But in that list, they also said, oh, by the way, we're going to break away from you. The 27 grievances against the king included things like the no taxation without representation. That came from the Stamp Act that we talked about. The judges in the colonies were dependent on the king for payment, for approval, to keep their office. So if the judges didn't do what he wanted them to do, he would just get rid of them. And the colonists said, hey, that's a little bit of a problem. There's a little bit of a conflict of interest if the judges are beholden to the king. He restricted immigration to the colonies. So in a nation that was trying to grow, in a nation that was a little lopsided on men and women ratio, in a nation where there were different religions or different communities of people that they wanted to bring in, and the king would say, oh, yeah, well, we're not going to let that grow because you guys are, causing too much trouble. Whatever his whim would be, he decided who was going to be allowed into the country or not. And he only wanted the good people, the people that were in his favor. And so restricting immigration was another one that they wrote as one of these 27 grievances. He cut trade off with the rest of the world in order to isolate the colonies and in order to force them to only buy the goods and services from the country or from the businesses that he wanted them to. And the East India Company is an example of that. The tea trade was floundering, so don't buy it from other countries. Now you can only buy it from my state-sponsored, I like these people tea company. And so cutting off trade with other countries, which also made things more expensive in the colonies in some instances, because he could then charge whatever prices he wanted and then just promote the companies he wanted. And then excited domestic insurrectionists among us. This is the putting in his people, the redcoats, the British loyalists, who were not necessarily colonists, and then promoting violence against them, locking people up without due process. Anything along these lines, they were saying, hey, you can't do that. And so here's our grievances, and if you don't listen to us, then we have a right to revolt and set up a new government. So the Declaration of Independence was kind of a, you need to listen to us, here's your last chance, but also they were like, no, we're done with you. Because by this time, shots are already fired, we're already in the middle of a war. All right. Once the American Revolution was done, the Treaty of Paris was signed and Britain said, all right, fine, you're your own country. The colonists had to decide, well, what kind of government are we going to set up? And we really, really do not want a king, right? No kings. And the first idea was we want a very weak central government. We don't want consolidated power. We don't want a strong executive. That's all a king is. So we're going to go in the complete opposite direction. And they wrote the Articles of Confederation. And this was a very loose articles that the states all signed on to. And they said, okay, we'll operate under this. But there were some very, very glaring problems with it. So the federal government was not allowed to tax the different states and was not allowed to tax the people. So it was just by good graces if you wanted to send money from your state up to the government, but they couldn't actually enforce it. So there was no money coming into the federal government. the states were competing with each other for foreign trade because every single state considered itself its own kind of sovereign nation. Yeah, we're all friends with each other and we're going to try and work together, but they were also competing for trade. Who has the better trade deal? Or within the states themselves, it might be, well, we're going to charge you tariffs, and then, Georgia says, well, we're going to charge you bigger tariffs right back, and then they're competing within each other. And so trade and commerce was hurt significantly under the Articles of Confederation. There was no national military. So the federal government could request troops, and every state could just say no. And often that's what happened. There was no consolidation. Every state just had their own militia. They operated however they wanted, up to the states. And I will say, all of these problems are also the same problems we had in the South in the Civil War. Confederacies, we're not learning our lessons, don't work because of these problems. The one vote per state. So you have really big states and populous states like Virginia that had the same amount of representation as the super tiny states like Rhode Island. And that really upset places like Virginia because they felt like we carry more money, more people, more trade, more everything, so we should have a bigger say in things. The Articles of Confederation, it had to be unanimous to change. And that just wasn't going to happen. You had such different ideas that were happening where northern states, southern states had very different plans for what they wanted, whether it was agriculture-based, industry-based. So you had places like Virginia who said, sure, we might have to pay more taxes, but we want more representation. Rhode Island's going to say, no, that's not going to work for us. And right there, everything is dead. So changing the Articles of Confederation, extremely difficult to do. There were no national courts, so you had no redress of grievances, and you didn't have an executive branch. You just had your Continental Congress that had to come together and make unanimous decisions. So it very quickly became apparent that this was not going to work as our new government. So the Congress came together and they said, okay, we're going to have another constitutional convention. And we're going to fix all the problems that we're having with the Articles of Confederation. And so the representatives showed up and they said, okay, let's go revise the articles. And then they said, okay, close all the doors, close all the windows. We know it's hot in July right now, right? All right, close the windows and close the door. We can't let everyone know what's happening. We're just going to throw out the articles and we're going to draft something new. But we can't tell them that because we have to get unanimous approval, and that's not going to happen. So we're just not going to tell anyone that that's what we're doing, and that's what we're doing. And so they just threw out the articles and said, all right, let's write our current Constitution. What are the problems that need to be fixed? Let's fix it, and we'll worry about the rest of it later. So you have James Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution. He drafted most of the language that is in the Constitution. The way we got to most of what we have in our Constitution was a lot of compromise because, again, even though now we're an independent nation, it does not mean the Founding Fathers agreed on everything. You still had a huge divide between southern states and northern states. There were people who said, one of the 27 grievances we sent to the king was that he was allowing the slave trade. So we need to get rid of the slave trade. And then you had Southerners going, no, hold on. We need that for our economy. So there was a divide when our Constitution was being written of what should go in it. The Founding Fathers were not all on the same page. And I think that's a misnomer sometimes, that people think, oh, they had these great ideas and they came together and they worked together and they were all in cahoots. And that is not the case at all. There were a lot of different things that they disagreed on, whether it's because of their own individual philosophies, which states they were from, which ideas they represented. One of the biggest one, the Virginia Plan versus the New Jersey Plan, which the 3/5 compromise fed into this. So under the Virginia Plan, keep in mind that's a big state, right? Virginia said, All of our representation should be by population, because we're big and we want more of a say. And New Jersey, which at the time was less populated, said, no. We're all equal in the colonies, therefore we should all have an equal say. And so everyone, one vote. All the states get one vote. It doesn't matter how big you are. And then Connecticut came in and they were like, how about we split it? We'll have the House that is represented by population, and we'll have the Senate that is 2 senators from each state. We split it, and that way it's a compromise, and both of you get a little bit of what you want and a little bit of what you don't want. And so they were like, all right, we'll go with that. And then the southern states said, but what about slaves? Because we want all of our slaves to count for representation, right? These are the people in our states, we count them all. And the other states were like, okay, so for taxation purposes also, right? We're gonna tax you based off of how many people are in your state. Oh, no, those aren't people. We're not gonna count them as people for taxation purposes. And that is how we came to the 3/5 compromise. It is, we will count every 3 out of 5 slaves for representation and taxation purposes. Because by this point, they had come to the conclusion there would not be a constitution if they tried to abolish slavery. So this is where the devil's deal comes into play in our history. And so that's what the 3/5 compromise is. Because again, it's always about money. So taxation was the big hang up, and representation. The debate over the delegates. There were some people that felt like Congress, which in England, Parliament elects the Prime Minister, right? A lot of countries, it is their legislative branch who elects their executive representative. So there were a lot of people who were like, well, that's how it's done in other places, so that's what we'll do. Congress will elect the president. And then there were a lot of people who said, no, we just established that we want the people to elect. So let's do a general popular vote. And once again, we had to come to some kind of compromise, otherwise this would never get through, and they came up with the Electoral College. The people will have a popular vote to elect representatives, and those representatives will then elect the president. And that's how we got what we have today, which is our Electoral College. One of the biggest hang-ups was the Bill of Rights. The Federalists felt we need a strong central government, and the Anti-Federalists said, that's great, we understand, like, the Articles of Confederation didn't work because there was no central government, but without a Bill of Rights guaranteeing individual rights and liberties, the government, this strong central government that the Federalists want, is going to trample all over the people. And so there were several states that said, we will not approve this Constitution unless you give us a Bill of Rights. Now, they had a lot more faith than I do in our government right now, because they said, okay, well, we'll do a Bill of Rights. Go ahead and pass this first, and then we'll tack on that Bill of Rights. And they went, okay. And then the Bill of Rights was added later. So the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers were publications that were put out that explained the different viewpoints of this is why we need a strong central government, this is why, it was another selling it to the public of why we're scrapping the Articles of Confederation and why we are moving to a stronger central government, but not trampling your rights, because we are going to tack on this Bill of Rights later. So James Madison goes through and he writes out our Constitution. And this is just a brief overview of what is in our Constitution. The preamble that most people know, we the people. And then Article 1, the legislative branch. Article 2, executive branch. Article 3, judicial branch, goes through. And then the 27 amendments that change the Constitution, that modify it in some way. The preamble is extremely short if you look at it. I mean, it's right there. We the people. It fits on one little PowerPoint slide. But it made such an impact throughout the world because, again, it establishes who's adopting this Constitution. Who are we writing this for? It is we the people, we are consenting to being governed by this Constitution. We are giving you permission that this is a government for the people and by the people. And why it's being adopted, we're going to lay it out: justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, and general welfare. The government is responsible for taking care of us as the people. And that is what we are telling you. To form a more perfect union, for us to come together, the government's responsibility is to provide these things to its people. And what is the Constitution? This is our supreme law of the land. So this trumps everything else. No state laws can trump this. No Supreme Court rulings are there to interpret it, but nothing else comes before the Constitution. These are key points in Article 1. Now, the first slide I showed you, we're going to be going into the legislative branch at the next discussion. We'll be going into it in more detail, so these are just kind of key highlights. And the articles kind of lay out just the organizational structure. So all of us who have worked and have had like standard operating procedures at work, processes and procedures, that's what this is. So it creates the bicameral Congress. We're going to have two houses. This is our Connecticut Compromise. Here's the Senate, here's the House, one by population, and one is equal representation. All of the legislative powers are vested in Congress. This is our lawmaking branch. That is your main power. The enumerated powers are the specific powers that are set aside for Congress. Taxing, regulating Congress, declaring war, raising and supporting army. You cannot take those away from Congress. Not supposed to take those away from Congress. The limits on powers, so this is the checks and balance. This is what you can do, this is what you can't do. So there's prohibitions such as suspending habeas corpus. We've heard a lot about this here lately in the news. Habeas corpus in Latin means present the body. So it's pretty much saying, as a government, because this was one of the issues that the king was doing to the colonists and its people, as a government, you cannot lock somebody up in prison and just leave them there. You have to present them in court and explain what charges are filing against them and have them go through the judicial process. We are saying you cannot do that. Our government is not going to do that to people. All right, that was a violation that the king was doing, and we're not going to have that here. The Bill of Attainder, and I know there are people in the room that are smarter than me about laws and stuff like that, but these are just, again, brief overviews. This is passing a punishment without ever going through the judicial process. So just looking at somebody and saying, you look like a criminal, let's go ahead and throw you in jail. Let's go ahead and pass a fine. So, and again, we're saying you can't do that. You can't take their lands away and just give them to your buddy. You have to go through the judicial process. And the ex post facto laws was another one of, you cannot make something illegal in hindsight. If chewing gum is illegal tomorrow, you cannot arrest me for doing it yesterday. All right? You cannot make retroactive laws to lock people up. And then granting titles of nobility, this goes back to the concept of we are all free and fair people, and nobody is above anybody else. So there's going to be no titles of nobility. The structure of the Senate, we kind of know how that works. 2 from each state, 6 years. There are no term limits. So you can run as many times as you want. The House, 2 years, no term limits, run as many times as you want. And there are a few other things like the ages that you have to be and stuff like that. We'll go into that one in the next one, but it lays out the structure, the rules and procedures, how they're going to run this, and then privileges and immunity for things like you can't be arrested for any speech you have on the floor. So you can't just say, I don't like what you're saying on the floor of the House and we're gonna lock you up. It's not supposed to happen. Free speech on the floor of the House. Article 2 covered the executive branch, the presidency, how the president is elected. Article 2 was modified by the, we'll get to it, but I want to say it's the 11th Amendment, of how many times a president can be re-elected. The removal from office, the president's powers, making treaties with other foreign countries, but it has to be approved by the Senate. So again, that's one of those checks and balances. Yes, you can do this, but yes, we have to approve it because consent of the government. And the duties were receiving ambassadors and taking care that the laws of the land are faithfully executed. It is the president's job to make sure everybody is abiding by the law. The judicial branch, our Supreme Court, it establishes not just the Supreme Court, but the whole federal court system and the lower courts within it. And this is where you have things that, again, based off of previous grievances and things that we wrote to the king, where judges are no longer serving at the behavior of the executive. If a judicial is independent, they serve during their life for good behavior. And their salaries can't be reduced. You can't stop paying them. You can't just get rid of them because you don't like what sentences they're passing down, what judgments are being made. Because they are an independent branch, independent of the executive, independent of the legislature. They are supposed to be above the partisanship that can happen in the legislative and executive branch.
Sorry, does this include judges that are elected as well?
So,
Those that are appointed and those that are elected?
so these are for, I would have to double check of how far down it goes, because these are the federal judges, which I believe federal judges are appointed for life, and then from there down, like the lower courts below that are the ones that are elected. So those aren't serving for life. And I can't remember at which point, when they talk about like the circuit courts, I can't remember where the dividing line is. But these are for the ones that are appointed, and they're appointed for life. Article 4 is the full faith and credit clause that it says if a law exists in one state, you have to recognize it in another state. What you will find is, and we'll get into this when we cover the judicial branch, there's a lot of things that kind of butt up against each other. Because if you think back to when gay marriage was made legal in some states, but not other states. And then some of the states where it was still not legal, they're saying, well, we don't have to recognize or, respect that you're married. But the full faith and credit clause in the Constitution said, yeah, you actually do. We're married in one state, that means we're married in all states. And then when the laws of the different states butt up against each other, a lot of times that's when it's escalated up to the Supreme Court to say, all right, make a decision on this. And then once the Supreme Court makes a decision, that's it for the entire nation. So a lot of Article 4 deals with you have to respect the states between each other, admission of new states because this was a growing nation, so we didn't have all 50 states yet. So how are we going to handle that when new states come in, and what does that mean? And then the extradition clause, you'll see this when somebody flees from one state to another and then they're extradited. Like, what's the most recent one that made headlines? Luigi Mangione, where he was taken up to New York and he was extradited back up to New York, saying that you don't get to run to another state and be exempt from the laws. Article 5 is how you amend the Constitution, 2/3 vote. The states have to approve it. There's some provisions that they're saying, hey, you cannot change this Like, this is just gonna be set in stone, so it's unamendable provisions. In history, one of the things that we saw was in the Articles of Confederation, it was so difficult to change it, even if we saw it wasn't working. And so they wanted to make sure that there was a way that it was not super easy to change, because otherwise, every time a new idea came around, they would just scrap the old one, put the new one in. But it was possible to change, because progress has to be made, new ideas develop, public opinion changes, and so they wanted a way to make sure that you can amend the Constitution. Article 6 is what makes the Constitution the law of the land. This is the supremacy clause. This is stating that the Constitution is the highest law in the land. And if there's any conflict between the states' rights and the federal rights win, because the Constitution wins. This also established the oath of office that all members of Congress, legislature have to make, affirming their loyalty to protect and defend the Constitution. The military has to make that also, protect and defend the Constitution. And no religious test. Does anybody know how many times God appears in the Constitution? 0. God is never mentioned in the Constitution. The founding fathers, even though some of them were humanists, some of them were Christians, several of them were religious, they all understood, based off of previous persecution, that having an established religion, having a religious test, was going to create a divide in a nation that was already a melting pot of ideas. And they said that religion and government conflict with each other, that government should be for the will of the people, for the good of the people, and it should be based off of the rationale and science and research and facts, not based off of religion. Nearly all the founding fathers, nearly all of them, agreed with this one, that the separation of church and state was one of the key components of our country. And then the last one, the debt assumption, is pretty much saying, yeah, everything from our previous government, we're going to take over the debt for that one. Article 7, that one is pretty much just how to accept the Constitution. So if this is what we're saying is our Constitution, how do we go about doing it? This is how we ratify it. New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify it. That's the 2/3 at the time. And eventually all 13 states ratified the Constitution. So the Bill of Rights was the compromise of, yes, we agree, we're going to tack this on. So several states ratified the Constitution on the condition that this would be added. And it was added to limit the government's power, to limit the federal power. I mentioned some of this before. The Federalists believed that the people in the states automatically kept the powers and kept their rights, and then the Anti-Federalists said, no, we need that in writing. Some of the argument was, well, if we put it in writing, then people are going to say, hey, that's the only rights that you get, and that's where the 9th Amendment came in, where they said, okay, no, if it's not written down, it doesn't mean we don't have it, we may just not have listed it. So that kind of countered that argument. And this is where the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Madison drew heavily from that one in order to draft the Bill of Rights. The original Bill of Rights, as it was presented, was 20 plus amendments long, and they whittled it down to 17, and eventually 12 were presented. 2 were left off because they could not agree on them. The first one that was left off was, for every 30,000 people, you're going to have 1 representative in Congress. If that was the case today, we'd have over 6,000 representatives. So it's probably a good idea that that one kind of got pushed to the wayside. They weren't very future looking on that one. The other one might sound a little familiar. It says Congress cannot get a pay raise, vote on a pay raise that goes into effect until the next congressional session. Might sound familiar because that is now our 27th Amendment. It just kind of hung out there for almost 200 years until a college professor wrote a paper on this amendment that was proposed and said, hey, this never expired. There was no expiration on when we could approve it. Maybe we should route this through Congress again. And then it was eventually passed in the 90s and approved. So now Congress doesn't get another raise until they're reelected. So, let me go back, because I skipped a part. We know about most of these amendments, the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. That was put first because that was the biggest one that the king violated and they felt was the biggest protection that the people needed. You have to have a free press. You have to be able to circulate the ideas, even if they're conflicting ideas. You have to be able to circulate those ideas in the United States. The right to assemble, that is practiced throughout our history. That is what the Boston Massacre, that started as an assembly of people. Boston had a lot of protests in its early days, and we have had protests throughout our history. You had the civil rights, you had the Civil War, you have protests that are happening today. And this is a way for the people, who are the ones who decide how to govern things, tell their leaders that they are happy or not happy with how things are going. And that has to be protected. Otherwise, everyone is just locked up for their ideas, and it's a violation. The Supreme Court has said that is a violation of your speech, your free speech. So most of us are familiar with this, the right to bear arms. So I won't go through each and every one of these. Most of us know the Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments. Amendment 11 prohibits the federal courts from hearing cases where a state is sued by another state. This one is actually not enforced too much anymore because states sue each other all the time, and then it gets escalated up in the courts. So this one is kind of one of those that it's still on the books, but it's not really enforced, and it's not really listened to all that much. The 12th Amendment modified the Electoral College. Early on, the Electoral College could elect a president from one party and a vice president from another party. And then no work got done because they were constantly at odds with each other. So the 12th Amendment was passed to say, no, when you elect the president and vice president, that's on one ticket, you're electing both of them. The Civil Rights, or the Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, abolished slavery, gave citizenship to freed slaves, and then said you can't deny their right to vote based off of either their race, their color, or the fact that they used to be slaves. Now, we all know in history this is not how that played out, because you had a lot of things like the Jim Crow laws and things like that, that poll taxes, reading tests, that did prohibit illegally former slaves from voting. However, because it was enshrined in the Constitution, we have been able to make strides where it was upheld that they should have equal rights afforded to everybody. Except for women at this point, it's still not there. 16th through the 27th Amendment. Most of these are kind of just fixing and tweaking things that were in there before. It authorizes Congress to collect income taxes. This was passed in the 1920s. Before that, we didn't have an income tax. You have prohibition as the 18th Amendment, and then just a few years later, they went ahead and overturned that because everybody in America needs a drink every once in a while. The 19th Amendment guarantees the women the right to vote. So it wasn't until 1920 that women had the right to vote. The 20th Amendment sets the start. We just had the presidential swearing in on January 20th of this year. The term limits, the 22nd Amendment, that one has come up in the news a lot lately, talking about running for third terms and things like that. That's the 22nd Amendment is pretty clear. You can run for 2 terms. Now you can serve 10 years as president, but that's one of those weird little caveats of if you're the vice president and the president steps down, but you're only serving less than 2 years of his term, then you can still have 2 terms of your own. That's the only exception. Otherwise, you are limited to 2 terms. And then the 27th Amendment, that's the one where it requires the law to increase or decrease the salary of members of Congress to take effect only after the next election. This is the one that sat on the books for hundreds of years. There is an argument that the 28th Amendment was passed, but it was not released by the National Archives, and there's a whole loophole saying that they put a time limit of only 7 years on that one, but without a president in office that's going to push that, that just kind of got set to the wayside. So we currently still have only 27 amendments to the Constitution. So that wraps up the overview of the Constitution, the history, and how we got here. There's a lot of things that are still relevant today. There is a lot of issues that we still fight for and figure out what's right and what direction do we want our country to go in. It's going to be a continuous process because even when this country was established, this was established as a great experiment. Can the people govern, and can they do it well for everybody? And we're still waiting to see how that all plays out. So here's a few websites if you want to go and look for more kind of overview civics lectures. Schoolhouse Rocks, one of my favorites from my childhood. If you remember I'm Just a Bill, they had a lot of other songs about civics lectures. Harvard just started offering a free civics course. So if you're interested in taking that, it gives an overview of civil engagement and the Constitution. So at this time, I'll ask, are there any questions or comments? Okay, thank you, everyone.